Morning, everyone. Welcome to the SVG Animation Extravaganza morning, where we guarantee you're going to hear about 5 to 1,000% more about animation in SVG than your typical Tuesday morning. Literally a guarantee. I don't know what we do if you say that's wrong, so just go with it. But to start off this morning, I'm going to talk about two things that we often don't think of as going together, specifically motion and inclusive design. It's a really common misconception that things like accessibility and inclusivity only come at the cost of design details like motion and other things that are like more designery, I guess. But it's really, that doesn't have to be the case. We absolutely can be purposeful, creative, and do all sorts of things with motion while also being inclusive and accessible. It really just comes down to how we approach the task at hand and getting to take advantage of some of the newer things we have at our disposal that maybe we didn't even just a short time ago. So, I wanted to start with a little story because the impact of inclusive design really solidified for me one day last year when I was walking my dog, because that's when profound things happen all the time. I was listening to podcasts. That's what I do. My dog walks really slow to assert her power in the relationship. I listen to podcasts, so I don't care. Don't tell her, please. Anyways, I was listening to this episode of 99% Invisible. It's called On Average. It's a really interesting one if you do anything related to design or product design. And I'm going to paraphrase one of the stories in here extensively, so definitely listen to it for the full story. But one of the stories they tell in this episode is a story of basically how fighter planes kind of came to exist the way that they do. In the 20s, when they made the first fighter planes, they designed the cockpits to match the average measurements of the 1920s pilots. Made sense, right? And so basically, this cockpit was designed for those average measurements. If you didn't fit those average measurements, you weren't a pilot. Go find something else to do, I guess. It made sense, and that worked for them for quite some time, until around the time World War II happened, and military aviation expanded greatly. Planes got fancier. They needed more planes and more pilots, and they were expanding this whole program. And they were expecting that, these planes were still designed to have cockpits that fit the average 1920s pilot. So they're expecting this great explosion of effectiveness and just amazingness from all of these new planes and pilots, but that's not what happened. They actually saw a decline in performance, and they're kind of what's the deal? But probably in a much more official-sounding way of asking that question. And so some of the things that were investigated, they were okay, maybe it's just really dangerous to fly. I mean, planes are fancy machines. Maybe it's just dangerous, and that's the deal. Some other solutions that were explored was maybe the pilots need more training. These planes are more complicated. They do fancier plane stuff. So maybe pilots just need more training. And none of that really solved the problem. So they went to look at the cockpits again, and they were hey, we designed these to fit the average pilot in 1920. It's the 1950s almost now, and we're as humans, much bigger and stronger than we were a couple decades ago. So clearly, we need to find the new average. Totally makes sense. So a group of researchers were tasked with the task of finding the new average for these new pilots. And along the way, they went and measured some 4,000-ish pilots, however many it would end up being. And along the way, the researchers suggested a side study. They were hey, we were kind of curious as researchers, how many of these 4,000 pilots actually have the average measurements? Which seems like a good research question to ask. So they went and they looked for that, and they picked 10 areas of measurement, of physical measurement, looked at all the pilots, and found that none of the 4,000 had all 10 of those average measurements. So okay, let's try 3. We'll see how many have 3 of these average measurements. And they came up with less than 5%. So that changed the philosophy of how planes were designed, and they started making cockpits with adjustable seats, adjustable pedals, adjustable whatever the steering wheel of a plane is called. I'm clearly an expert in planes. And now it's that's just how stuff is designed, even outside of the military. And there's this quote they had while telling that story that really hit home for me, where they said that if you're designing something for the average pilot, you're designing it for no one. And I was ooh, that's powerful. And then I was hold on. How many meetings have I been in where we're discussing the average user? A lot. And if there's no average pilot in their story, maybe there's no average user for us either. As it turns out, this story is a really popular one to be told in articles and books about inclusive design because it's just such a powerful illustration of what can happen when we make assumptions about all our users being the same or having certain qualities that they share across the board. And I think in a way this is really, this kind of approach to inclusive design is very much like it's a modern problem. Like the assumption that people will adapt themselves to fit the software we make is just not a thing we can assume anymore. But I think years ago we could. Like if you think back in the day, the early days of the web, we probably had an average user, right? We were like, well, our users are sitting at a desk in their office, they have a computer on their desktop and a monitor thing and a mouse thing, and they're not distracted, they're just here hanging out. And there was probably a time where that was true. But it's just now that the web is a part of daily life for so many people and there's so many things we just need to accomplish on it at all times, it's we don't have that anymore. There is no average user. There's no one group or even small number of groups we can put all of our users into. So that kind of really changes how we approach things. And I really like this sort of definition of inclusive design that Susan Goldsman has in one of her books, and she's one of the kind of pioneering folks of inclusive design, where she describes it as designing a variety of ways or a diversity of ways to participate, which is essentially what happened in that pilot story, right? They changed it so more people could use the cockpit, and then suddenly they had a wider audience. They had more people they could have be pilots, and things went better. And it's this idea, I like the idea of inclusive design being the approach of creating a diversity of ways to participate, not creating trying to make one thing that will work for everyone, but a variety of ways. And it's kind of like Sarah mentioned yesterday that one day it might seem just unimaginable that we didn't always design a diversity of ways to participate in our products. Kind of like the same way now you're could you imagine buying a car and they're well, the seat doesn't adjust and you can't move the pedals. You'd be no, you just wouldn't do it. So we're going to turn that lens specifically onto motion. And one thing I want to point out before we dig into it is something that this talk is not about. This talk is not about why animation is bad or reasons we shouldn't use it, because I don't believe that. Clearly, from my intro, you kind of would assume. But it's really about how we can use animation responsibly in light of creating this diversity of ways to participate. Animation does have a whole ton of potential positive outcomes it can have on UX, things like all of this stuff in this list. If you want to dig into more of these, since we're not going to get into some detail today, you can check out the AEA YouTube site that Jeffrey mentioned yesterday. I have some previous talks on it. I also wrote a book about it. Sarah also wrote a book about it. They go very well together. They match. So if you want to dig into more of that, that's where you can find some of that, but we're not going to, those things are all still true, this goes along with it, but we're not going to get into those details today. So inclusive design really does cover more than just accessibility, but I think that it's pretty tough to say you're inclusive if you haven't covered the basics of accessibility. So we're going to start our journey with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which if you haven't looked at in a while, which I don't know, there was definitely a gap where I hadn't looked at it for a while. Because years ago, there was the Web Content Accessibility Guideline 1.0, and I was the way they talk about animation just it's just really hard to connect to how I work. I don't know about this. But they've updated it to 2.0 and even, I think, 2.5 recently. So if it's been a while, you should take a look at it again, because it definitely has a lot more that applies to animation now. They have 3 specific guidelines that apply specifically to animation. And the first one of those is pause, stop, and hide. You'll never guess what this tells you to do. 3 guesses. No, just kidding. I'm just going to tell you. It says that if you have anything that is moving automatically, that you should provide controls to pause, stop, or hide that thing unless the content is something that's so critical to what's going on that you can't. So an example people use a lot is a stock ticker. If you're showing the updates of stock prices, don't stop that because that's the important content. Anyways. There's examples like that we're okay, yeah, but I'm not doing a news ticker thing, so I probably don't need to pay attention to this one. I probably can just check it off and go. But there's some things that we do fairly regularly that fall under this too we might not realize initially. Things like auto-advancing carousels, auto-playing videos. Maybe you've seen those on the web recently. Animated backgrounds or illustrations. These things play automatically. They animate, and they just start, and they go for more than 5 seconds, especially if they're looping, because that's forever. And there should be some pause and play controls to turn those off. And the guidelines don't specify how those need to look. They just should be there because it's an important thing to have. So the second guideline that applies specifically to animation is 3 flashes or below threshold, which is coincidentally also the name of my new hardcore band. We're auditioning drummers, if any of you are into that. But it's actually a really important, besides being the perfect band name, it's also a really important one of these guidelines, probably the one that has some of the most detailed research that you can dig into around it. And it really sort of stems from kind of like broadcast days where they realized that, hey, if we flash the screen a bunch of times, people can have seizures. That's really bad. So the original version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines basically said, don't flash anything ever. The updated version is basically like, don't flash anything, but if you really have to, we have these guidelines that are essentially like measurements of pixel areas relative to screen size and viewing angle, where it is probably safe, or it is safe, based on the research rather, to flash some parts of the screen. So if you find yourself in this situation where you're like, well, I really need to flash some stuff, there is some guidelines for how to do that. There's different ones for red, because flashing the color red is much more serious than other colors. But in general, like for me personally, I'm just gonna try not to flash stuff ever. And it might sound like a thing. You're like, when does that ever happen? It happens a little more than we think, especially when it comes to things that are more like designed to be like an experience or more of like editorial design. Things like this article. This was an article about how millennials will never have any money or jobs. Fitting acronym. And it had like great art direction and style, right? It went for this kind of like 8-bit video game feel and super glitchy, because you're like, it's like the game of life, and that's basically what they were going for. Totally made sense for the content. But as you can see from this screen recording, the frames at the bottom there, if you look at, well, I marked where they changed the color really quickly, so those are kind of the flashes of color. And I know the timeline's small numbers, but that's definitely more than 3 times a second, like a lot more. So that's potentially dangerous. Now, to their credit, this is not the top part of the article. You had to actually scroll down to get here. And they did have a text-only version for like people who are like, if flashing bothers you, read this text-only one. But I think articles like this and this, like designs like this kind of show that it really does happen more than you think. And it's not like, you're not usually going to like, there's not like a checkbox of like in the design specs, like flash screen many times. It's usually because you're trying to do something else and it happens along the way. So a lot of times people will put kind of this sort of front door on it and be like, hey, you're about to go into a thing that flashes some colors. Don't come here if that's not cool for you. Which is one way to handle it for sure, and definitely better than just flashing the screen at people. But it still excludes some parts of your audience. And this particular one was for an agency's New Year's site. You can see from the frames what they were doing. There's like definitely a lot of red, black, and white flashing. It's like a game that takes you maybe 2 to 5 minutes to complete, and then it just says like Happy 2019 at the end. So like, I feel like you can make the argument that like this isn't important content, it's not like critical content, and people who can't view it because they can't handle the flashing aren't really missing anything. Like you could make that argument, but also by setting it up this way, and even though you've told them, hey, this might be a bad place for you, you've definitely excluded some people. And it's kind of like, how do you balance that out? I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I feel like it's a thing to be considered when we make this sort of stuff. So then we get into the third guideline, which is one that is new in this particular version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's animation from interactions. Because those first 2 guidelines so far dealt with motion that was initiated by like the thing in the browser itself, like the page itself initiated that motion. Animation from interaction is stuff that happens based on, well, interaction. I'm like explaining words that you all totally know to you in the same words that they are. So animation from interaction actually has a bit of a confusing description. It's like, okay, motion animation triggered by interaction can be disabled. You can also read. But they talk about 2 things in this definition that are very interesting. Motion animation, which you're like, wait, aren't those the same things? Are you repeating yourself? Do you have an editor? And then that last part where they're like, unless it's essential for the functionality of the information being conveyed. So you're like, oh, interesting. So it's more nuanced than just like, shut it down, which is how sometimes this particular guideline gets interpreted. So I want to talk about motion animation first, because they have a very wordy definition of it that you can totally read yourself if you want to. But I wanted to highlight that last line where they kind of describe what it's not. They're like, motion animation does not include changes of color, blurring, or opacity. And essentially what they're saying is that all motion is animation, but not all animation is motion. Because you can animate a thing and not have it move, right? If you change the opacity or color, it's just where it was, and you've animated that property, but you haven't animated it in any kind of movement. And that's an important distinction for this guideline, as well as a few other things we're going to talk about today. So they also give you some, like a checklist or some advice on how you can meet this criteria, which is helpful because it's a little ambiguous. You're like, well, how do I know when it's motion? How do I know when it's, give me a list. So they do. And they're like, all right, number 1, Avoid using unnecessary animation. And I feel like all of us have this covered, because if you're here at an event apart today or any of the days, you're probably not the kind of person that's like, hey team, did you know CSS can flip buttons in 3D? Let's flip all our buttons in 3D. Hopefully none of you have said that at a meeting. Pretty sure that's not this crowd. So we got that one done. Then they're like, all right, provide a control for users to turn off non-essential animations from interaction. You're like, okay, sure, but I still have questions. Then their third point is like, take advantage of the reduced motion feature in user agent and operating systems. And you're like, huh, interesting. So those are the two we're going to focus on a little bit more of how we pull that off. But I think it makes sense to first take a look at why this sort of guideline would be there to begin with. Like, what's the deal with motion, animation, interaction? That's not a sentence, but you will know what I mean. Basically, it's because we've realized over the last few years, really come to realize, it's been around before that there's a significant group of our audience that can actually be made physically sick by motion on screen. Generally, these are people that have what you might call a vestibular disorder, which is kind of like a really blanket term for any sort of balance-related disorder. And even seeing motion on screen, even though that might not seem like it's powerful enough to cause physical effects for people, really can. So there's some great articles, like first-person accounts of how this works. Eileen Webb wrote this one here, where she talks about how some of these highly interactive, highly animated pieces kind of mess with her and her migraines. There's a Great List Apart article talking about a first-person account of having a temporary vestibular disorder and how that affected using the web. This one is really interesting too because, for one thing, because it was a temporary thing, so kind of getting that comparison. And you might think that this article just focuses entirely on motion, but there's even other things in our designs that can affect folks with vestibular disorders. So it's not only for motion, but it is probably the main thing to look at. So vestibular disorders, it's kind of a big, ambiguous term. It essentially means any sort of disorder or condition, temporary or permanent, that affects the kind of internal balance system, which is our vestibular system. So it's like a very broad umbrella of things, right? You're like, okay, that could be a lot of things. It totally could. And it's really kind of like, there's no one way to have a vestibular disorder. There's not like there's a variety of different types of things that fall under that umbrella. And there's also a variety of different things that trigger people who have vestibular disorders. Some people are triggered by motion on screen, some people aren't. The context can make a really big difference too, where I've talked to some folks who are totally fine playing like first-person shooters or like first-person driving games where like stuff is flying all around and there's like tons of stuff moving. But then they go to open like photos on their Mac, and that full screen transition just that actually causes them to have some negative symptoms. And it's like, you would think that if that happened, it would happen in the driving game too, but the context can be very different. And people don't necessarily say that they have a vestibular disorder. Like, usually people just say they are sensitive to motion or they have motion sensitivity. It's pretty uncommon, I've noticed, for people to be like, hi, I have a vestibular disorder. Probably because it's a big word and no one knows what it means, but being motion sensitive, we're like, oh, I get it. So the thing that causes, the problem of seeing motion on screen, why that causes symptoms and effects for people with vestibular disorders is because it creates a mismatch between what they see and what's happening, like what they believe is happening or what their brain kind of thinks is happening. So it's essentially a mismatch, but not one that's this cute. It's like the opposite of this kind of mismatch, but I saw a cute kitten and dog and I had to put it in the slides. So this is a really big dog and a really tiny kitten. They're probably going to have great adventures together. But the kind of mismatches that cause problems for folks with vestibular disorders are the bad kind of mismatches. It's the kind of thing where you're looking at a screen and you're like, by all accounts, everything I know about my physical body, I am standing still. And then you go and you scroll and stuff flies around and your brain's like, wait, that looks like we're moving. This says we're not moving. I don't know what to do. And that mismatch causes all sorts of problems. If you're like me and you can't read in cars, it's, I think, a similar type of experience where, like, if I'm in a car and I'm trying to look at directions or read something on my phone, this is not moving, but this is moving, and my brain's just like, I don't get it, let's throw up. So I'm a terrible road trip companion. I can't do anything but drive or sleep. But I feel like it's very much the same kind of thing. It's like one input saying we're moving, one input saying we're not, and different people react in different ways for that. Some people are just fine, and their brain can be like, it's cool. I know people who can read books in cars. I don't understand. The idea of it just kind of makes me a little ill, actually. But one thing that is in common, despite the fact that there's not one way to have a vestibular disorder, there's one thing that's common with all the research I've done in this space is that it's not like, none of the people I've talked to are like, we want everything to never move ever and blah, everything is terrible. It's more that, like this quote from Eileen where she's saying, like, it's not saying you shouldn't make cool stuff. It's not saying you shouldn't do this at all. It's just I would like a way to participate in it that's not going to make me sick, which fairly reasonable request when it really comes down to it. You're like, yeah, you got a point. So when we go back to that definition of motion animation, they kind of hint at this idea that some animation is triggering and some is not, which is essentially exactly what they're saying by trying to kind of segment it of describing it as motion animation. And we can segment that even further and kind of get really specific about the kind of motion that is potentially triggering. So there's a pretty well-defined list of things that will have a really great chance of being triggering. So some of those things are things like scrolling and zooming. And I should note, I'm going to show some stuff that is potentially triggering. So if you are motion sensitive, you already know, and you can skip those parts. But I think it's really helpful to see it to kind of get a sense of how things are. Anything that does have, all the videos I'm using are less than 5 seconds long, and any video that has it has an orange background that you'll see in the next slide. So scaling and zooming, generally this means like scaling and zooming to a great extent. Like if you're scaling something from 90% to 100%, unlikely to fall into this category. But if you're scaling something like they do on the iOS app, entering your app situation, there's probably a better name for that. There's a really big scaling and zooming happening here. When you click on one of these icons, it zooms into your main app that you've just opened, and then it goes back. And you get that very directional, very fast, very a lot of motion going on there. When this first came out, people wrote all sorts of articles to break down the physics of how fast that is moving and how fast you're throwing that icon. I think they said it's 25 feet away and going at 40 miles an hour or something, and you're like, oh, no wonder this is a problem. But the mismatch there is this very flat-looking set of icons, right? And then all of a sudden the motion is it's not flat, blah, here you go. And that's a really drastic move and a really drastic zoom, and that's the mismatch that can cause problems there. Spinning and vortex effects can also be an issue, and these ones tend to be problematic even when they're not very big and exaggerated. Like a small amount of spinning or a tiny vortex, whatever that is, can also be a problem. I feel like spinning is more the thing we run into than vortex effects. If you're making a vortex effect, I think you know what you're getting into there. But the spinning is one that you might not realize right away. So here's a site. This was actually one of the first ones I saw that kind of did some things around having reduced motion, so we'll look at this one twice. But when we're here and we're just going to the site with regular settings, we get here and we see some text going in, and we see this little star field spinning, and it spins forever and ever, even though my video just stopped. And you're like, they're just little dots, they're just tiny, but they're spinning around, making this spinning motion all the time, and the text in front of them is not moving, and your screen is not moving, and you're not moving, and that's where we start getting that mismatch there. That circular motion can be especially problematic. A little more drastic version would be something like this, where it's a pretty common sort of header thing. They're like, check out stuff, and then they spin and spin. They actually get faster if this was more than a 5-second thing. But so the whole is similar thing, right? Photo and text are static, thing behind it spinning, and that's where you start getting this sense of mismatch. So the spinning and vortex can be pretty problematic. Also, multi-speed or multi-directional movement, which is a mouthful to say, but we probably see it more than you even notice. But that would be things like this site, where when you scroll downwards as one scrolls, at least on sites that we're looking at here, and this is what happens. So a lot of multi-directional and multi-speed, right? You start scrolling, the things move up towards you, and they're like, we go in 2 directions, and then they come back. So it's multi-directional, 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 multi-speed. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. It's very beautiful, but a lot going on there. And maybe this example, or even the words multi-speed, made you think of a thing that comes up a lot. Maybe you're like, that's parallax. You're like, yep. The whole definition of parallax, whether you're doing pretend parallax or real science parallax, is that things that are different distances away move at different speeds. Multi-speed by default, right? So Sorry, parallax lovers. Parallax pretty much universally is a trigger for people with motion sensitivities. As soon as things start moving at different speeds, when they're not moving at different speeds, it's just a terrible mismatch situation. So more traditional parallax, even stuff like this, where it's just like images in the background and the front are moving at different speeds, and the text in the middle floats. Different kinds of floats. It's a very floaty feeling. That multi-speed, and even though that's not multi-directional, can still be very triggering. So, I mean, this isn't to say that parallax is always bad, even though that wouldn't, I don't know, some people have that opinion. I don't know if I could really argue with it, but it's not necessarily always bad. It's just that it's always going to be, or pretty much always going to be, a trigger for some people. And if we're going to use parallax, we should probably make some considerations for allowing people who would be affected by it to still get to our content. If you want to dig more into what parallax is good for, or if you're in a meeting and they're like, we should parallax stuff, this is a great article to bring up because it's from the Nielsen-Norman Group and no one can argue with them. It has a great title too. It's What Parallax Lacks. And you're like, what does it lack? And this kind of goes through the things that parallax is actually good for, which there are things it's good for. It's a short list, but it's real. And then the longer list of things that parallax maybe isn't so great for and why it's not so great for that. Besides just this idea of triggering motion sensitivities, they have other reasons as well. So it's a good one to have in your pocket if you work with people who love parallax, or if you just want to do parallax responsibly, because that is possible. It's a thing. So one other thing that's pretty much universally triggering is constant animation near text, which is one of those things that when you see it like listed out, you're like, I think I know what where they're going with this. This is another article I read recently. It's about how millennials will never be able to retire because they'll never be able to save money. I read only the most uplifting news. And this article, once again, the art direction is like great. They have these pull quotes, and it's about how millennials are going to lose all their money or never be able to hold on to it or whatever. So these pull quotes animate like this. As you're looking at them, the coins fall out because that's all your money going away. And they come back so it can play again. And I mean, art direction, perfect. They had a great header that follows this whole thing and everything. And I totally understand why these are here and why they're looping like that, right? It's because they're like, well, the article's really long and the pull quote's down here. How do we know when people have scrolled that far? We don't know when to play the animation, so we'll just have it loop forever. So no matter how long it takes them to read, they'll still get to see it play. Of course, the problem is it'll play forever next to the text they're trying to read, and a lot of people will have to actually like put their hand in front of that so they can read the text around it to block it out. And this kind of situation is something that can be triggering not just for folks with motion sensitivities, but also anyone who has like issues with like attention and focus because like this thing is moving and I'm trying to read, that kind of thing. So this is the sort of thing that like we could fix fairly easily with something, basically just kind of setting it up differently, right? Of just being like, hey, what if we like did a little intersection observer thing and just played it once while it's in view? That would solve this. Though my guess is the CMS that they use probably wouldn't allow that in this case. But it's just like one of those things that seems like such a good idea because no one will miss that. But then the problem also is that no one will miss it because it's always going. So large movements are also something that can be very triggering. And it's a little tough to have examples of this because it's large movements relative to the screen size itself, right? Like I think part of the reason that iOS zooming thing is such a trigger for folks is even though it's a small screen, it's taking up that whole screen and covering a lot of space relative to that screen. So the same thing with like full screen transitions or like giant color wipes that you see for page transitions, those kinds of things can be triggering as well. And sometimes things that are, maybe small and just fine on like a laptop screen or a desktop screen are like, oh, that's okay. But then when you see it on a smaller screen, it's suddenly much larger in that context, and then it becomes an issue. So anything that's moving, let's say like more than half of the stuff on screen at once is probably a potential trigger area. This is one that's a little less black and white of like, the one of like animating next to text. You're like, yes, you either have that or you don't. This one's like, well, is it large? It can be a bit more of a gray area. So to dig into a little bit more detail, if you want more detail on some of these types of triggering animations and more examples of them, I wrote an article on A List Apart a few years back, which this talk is kind of like the full circle version of. Because in this article, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if we could do things like this? And today I'm going to be like, we can do things like this. So cool. The internet's amazing. And the WebKit blog also digs into some other kinds of examples where they show sort of like what is triggering, give you examples and how that could be fixed. So there's a lot to further research you can do on those if you want to. But one thing I want to point out that I think is very important is some things that are not on this list. Specifically, things like animated color changes, opacity fades, small movements, which you might realize or might remember sound pretty similar to that whole thing, that motion animation definition of the things they said weren't motion animation, and also are probably the most common things you'll do for your just kind of like baseline UI animations. You know, if you're just like have an interface, you have some components that have some animation to them, it's probably things like button fades or color changes or opacity changes or very small movements. So, like, I find that a lot of the most common stuff we do maybe doesn't even necessarily like cross that threshold into being potentially triggering. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that there is a designation between animation that's potentially triggering and stuff that is not. So because of all this, you know, if we go back to that list where they're like, hey, you know, maybe provide ways for people to opt out of motion and respect the prefers reduced motion query. That's a tool that we have to really help us take care of, or to help us like design intentionally and intelligently around some of these things. So the prefers reduced motion query is something that is actually pretty new to our space. Like, if you were here yesterday, Sarah mentioned it in her talk. If that was the first time you've ever heard of it, like, I mean, don't feel bad, because it's actually a really new thing. You're like, well, should I have known about this? No, it hasn't been around all that long. I have a timeline for you, though. It's a great one. So the whole idea that maybe motion on screen could be a trigger for people, and that maybe those of us as people who design for screens need to consider this as a thing that we do, really didn't like come up in our, like, I guess, general industry consciousness until around 2013, where that's when iOS 7 was released, and where we first started seeing that zoomy transition that we saw earlier. And once that came out, we started seeing articles like this, where they're like, why is iOS 7 making people sick? And they were basically like, because of the zooms. They went into more detail than that, but that is my summary of it. Then a little later that year, iOS 7 changed some things up, and they were like, hey, we have the reduced motion setting, which may or may not have already been there, it depends which article you read, but they made that reduced motion setting in iOS turn off that zoom and replace it with an animation that was more of a crossfade and therefore not triggering because it didn't have that large movement. Then we saw articles like this. Like, your phone won't make you throw up anymore. I feel like that's like you're like, good. Good baseline to have. Like, I would like my phone to not make me throw up. Cool. So that was good. And this started getting some attention of like, oh, hey, this is a thing, right? Like, maybe before this, the only people who made stuff for screens that really thought about this as an issue was maybe like game designers and stuff. We just didn't assume it was for us as people making apps and websites. So then a little while later, this timeline is not to scale, but sometime later in 2014, the prefers reduced motion query was proposed, the idea being that, like, hey, if people need this on their devices, on like native apps, maybe it'd be good to have it on the web too. What do you think? People were like, yes, good idea. Later on, the reduced motion setting was added to macOS. Originally, it was only on iOS. Now it's also on macOS. Somewhere along in this timeline, it was also added to Windows. I couldn't find a date, so it's not on the line, but at some point, you can also set a request reduced motion on Windows as well, and it's definitely been there before Windows 10. So that's kind of how this came about and why we have the tools that we have today, and why it is that it seems so new, because it's like, well, kind of is. So if you are someone who wants to have reduced motion, you would go into your preferences. This is the macOS one. The iOS one looks really similar. And you'd be like, check the reduced motion box. Cool. And then you would get reduced motion both in your OS and any app, or we'll see soon, websites that respect that. If you were on Windows, you'd be like, don't show animations on Windows, and you would check that box. So there's also settings in for Android as well. And you know, like Sarah was saying yesterday, like the wording and kind of like general, I don't know, kind of everything behind all of this is maybe, there's definitely, you can see some things you're like, well, I'll show animations on Windows. That doesn't really explain what that does, but you know, this is kind of where things are at for right now. As far as browser support goes, it's pretty good. There's a lot of green boxes. It's supported in Safari and iOS and macOS. Obviously, those were some of the first ones for it to come up in. It's also supported in Firefox. That was the first one to give us support on Windows. And then Chrome's got it now, too. And look at that little green box coming up for Edge. What do you know? And the little green box for Android? What's happening? There's never any green on that side of the... Anyways, so support's doing pretty darn well. It's really expanded greatly in the recent past, and we're going to see more support as we move forward, too. So the way we use it is, in CSS, we use it just like any other media query, and we're like, hey, query this media? I don't know, is that how we say it? Whatever. Like, tell me the setting for this. And if this prefers reduced motion comes back as true, you provide some kind of alternate behavior for the motion that might be triggering. Cool. Generally, the advice is like, stop the animation, provide alternate styling. Done. Or in this comment, alternate behavior. In JavaScript, do the same thing, but like get kind of wordier, but generally the same idea of like, hey, listen for this. Do we have this, is this match media come back as true or false? And you're like, okay, true, cool. We'll do some sort of thing. We'll reduce some behavior and a little bit more to like listen to that and make sure those changes happen. But the same idea of just checking if it's true or false and doing a thing based on what you get back. So the prefers reduced motion query can have two values, and it essentially can give you back a false, which is no preference, or a true, which is reduce. So the way this is structured makes it maybe like a little difficult to do like a really clean progressive enhancement sort of situation, because you're like, oh cool, we have this query, I'll just like layer in all the regular motion, and then I'll only give you the more like enhanced motion if you said you can handle motion. But that's not really how it works, because the false no preference could also mean they just never found that checkbox, didn't see it, didn't bother to set it. So we don't have so the only value that we can really rely on is that false, which means that kind of layering progressive enhancement just is a little more difficult to pull off in that clean way. So the only value we can really trust is false. That means someone intentionally picked false and they would like some reduced motion. But we can still work with that. And you might be thinking around this time like, hey, browsers, why don't you do this for us? You know what we've given you to display. You see the animation. Can't you just shut it down and be done with this? Like, can't you make our jobs easier? And technically they could, at least in small pockets. They could do this for like CSS animation and web animation API animation, because they have some control over that. A little less so over JavaScript animation, but they could probably do that too. But the problem is, browsers could not do this for us automatically in any way that would guarantee they're not going to break all of our stuff. Basically, the usability implications of them trying to do it automatically are pretty commonly negative. It's like stuff will break, so that's why that doesn't happen. We'd probably be really angry at them if they broke it. And this is also why a lot of those browser extensions that are like meant to reduce motion are like, turns off all the motion, and then you try and use it and it doesn't. It's because it's really hard to do well, especially if you don't know the context of the animations you have. And most of the time, if you're using something that's just trying to shut it all down, you're going to break a lot more stuff than you're going to fix, is what it kind of comes down to. So there's a little more nuance to it than just turning it off or turning it on, which is why the prefers reduced motion query is so useful, and kind of why we get the power to do this ourselves. It's like we control what gets stopped and what doesn't, and we can do that in a way where we're aware of the context, and we can do that responsibly too. So how do we respect reduced motion, which is what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines suggest we do? How do we do it? Like, what kinds of things should we do? The biggest thing I think is important to kind of remember as you're tackling this idea of respecting it is the idea that reduce is not the same as remove. For some of the reasons I just mentioned, where removing can often equal broken. And people who have motion sensitivities, and like if we think back to that quote from Eileen, where she's like, I just want a site that doesn't make me sick. She's not asking, like, they don't want a site that's broken. They don't want a site that looks kind of weird or is stripped down and like removed of all design or UX considerations. They just want a site that doesn't make them sick, which is very different than a site that's broken. So reduce and remove are two different things, and reducing is the more nuanced way of getting to that. So we could do something, so a lot of times when the prefers reduced motion query comes up, especially on social media, we see stuff like this where people are like, I've got it, I've solved it, these 7 lines of CSS or fewer if you don't have so many line breaks, will fix everything. Just put this in your CSS and you're done. And it would be cool if that was true, but like, you know how when things sound too good to be true, and they're not? This is definitely one of those. This seems like it'd be so perfect. You're like, yeah, just remove it all and we're good. But I call this like the bulldozer approach, because basically what it does is it just comes on and it's just like, are you an animation? Blah, gone. Doesn't care what the animation was supposed to do, doesn't care what breaks if it happens, it's just gone. Also, it's important, so good luck overriding that. So this seems like it'd be such a good solution, but for some of the reasons I mentioned just before, it's not exactly. And there's one thing in particular that it will definitely, there's many things it could break, but there's one situation it definitely will break. And I think it's best illustrated with a little character I call Bear Puppy. So imagine Bear Puppy represents some very important content on your site. It doesn't have to be cute and furry, it could just be important, but if it was both, you've got a really good site there. So Bear Puppy is hanging out off screen somewhere, and you've decided that Bear Puppy is going to get animated into view, he's going to get animated on, and you're going to use a transition or an animation, whichever you prefer, to bring Bear Puppy onto screen. So if we use that rule and we're just like animation none, transition none, we're essentially just blowing away that entire path. So Bear Puppy now has no way to get on screen ever because you've just like destroyed his, Bear Puppy lifeline to the screen, and he will never be viewed or viewable or usable or anything. So if Bear Puppy was actually important content, your user that asked for reduced motion is like, why is your site blank? Why is it broken? Why can't I do these things? So that's the main thing that a rule like that can easily break. And unless you can be sure that you never do this ever and will never in the future, that's a pretty big potential for breaking. If you really do need, you're just like, I just need a quick fix, I just need like one rule that will take care of things, this one is slightly better. Because it sets the durations to 0, it doesn't remove them. It means something that is invisible off screen will at least still come onto screen. And it does have a little bit more of a broad selector for things that might be animated. But it's still very bulldozery, and then it's just like, everything do this, with no consideration as to what they're for, and this could still break things. Like this one, even though it's a little bit less, like you won't leave Bear Puppy hanging, there's still some things to be cautioned around this. Like if there was a commercial for this one, it would have a warning of something like, talk to your doctor if you're using JavaScript or animated GIFs or video or experiencing problems with Safari 12.1. Because you will have problems. So this is why my recommendation is, instead of trying to find like the perfect rule that will erase everything and break the least, because that's just such an impossible task. Even this one, even though it won't leave content hanging, it still assumes the end state of your animation is where the most important content is. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It's not going to work on JavaScript, because this is just CSS. If you have animations that are partly in JavaScript, partly in CSS, or things that should work together, you just broke half of them. If you have anything that's like video or animated GIFs, it doesn't touch that either. So it just doesn't quite have the fixing power that we might wish it did. So reducing where needed is definitely, in my opinion, the better approach of finding those animations that are potentially triggering and then dealing with them individually to reduce them and provide a safer alternative. So for example, the site that had the spinny star field earlier, if you go to the site with prefers reduced motion checked on, you would see this instead. Where the text doesn't animate in, the star field doesn't spin around, but all of those hover animations, even that little bit of a button scale, are still there. Like all the little nuances that make this like some pleasant interactions, giving you that hover feedback, all of those things are still there, but the spinning star field and the bigger movements have been removed. And overall, you don't feel like you're missing anything, nothing's broken. It's just like, oh, cool, I don't get dizzy when I watch this site. Thanks. iOS does a similar thing where instead of having the zooms, they give you this instead, where they just have a nice little crossfade where they're like, hey, no zooms, just a little fade. They still give you that little hint of which icon it's coming from, like that little flash ahead of time, or a little fade, I guess it is. So you lose a little bit of that directional information of exactly where it's coming from, but you still get those visual hints, and that's something that's safer for anyone who's triggered by the zooming motions. So essentially, the approach is to take a thing that's animating, called thing in this case, and maybe you've originally got it set up to have a movement, and you're just like, move over, or up, or whatever. And when someone comes, and when you just have the prefers reduced motion query, you detect that's being set to true, you're like, hey, instead of moving, just fade yourself. So we can make some pretty easy swaps to adapt animations that might be triggering to make them be not triggering. A more specific example is always useful. Imagine you were going to build a header like this, where things fly in. So we've got multi-direction with the photos, multi-speed, because those are moving at very different, and multi-direction. I've got them all of the things. And the way this one is set up, we're using transitions to make this header, and we're essentially saying, hey, these are the plant photos. All of you, we're going to start your transition with you translated somewhere other than when you would normally be, right? So intrinsically, they'd just be in a row, and we're like, haha, don't, which is essentially what we're doing with those transforms. And then we set a transition based on some variables we have for duration and our easing. So that's where they start, and we tell them to transition. So then their endpoint with this totally realistic CSS selector totally works. Try it. It doesn't. This is summarized code. Instead, so the ending state, since we move them out this way, we're like, go back to where you would have been, and that's what the transition will actually translate. And a trick I've tried to do is I'll start like throwing an opacity 1 here, even though I never adjusted the opacity anyways, and I'll just use that later. So then for the reduced motion version, I'll just be like, translate to where you already were, which is technically there's a transition, but not really, because you're like, be where you already were and start your opacity at 0. So now with that exact same transition in place, those photos, instead of being like floop, will just be like fade, and we'll still have that stagger. They'll still go at the times that they were, but we'll just have that opacity translating instead of the actual transform. And then the text, which is the one above, that one is just like, just don't even move. Same deal, right? Instead of coming from here to go to there, just stay where you are and fade in. That can be a pretty easy way to just kind of get that quickly without doing a lot of extra coding. So then when we have prefers reduced motion enabled and being true, we see this. Similar idea, we didn't have to like erase a whole bunch of stuff or pull out a bunch of things. We just adjusted which property was actually translating, or transitioning rather, which was also translating, which is, anyways, that's a tongue twister and a half. So we could do that with JavaScript-based animation as well if we wanted to. And another example that I think could come up fairly frequently is this idea of like animating to your scroll position, which is a pretty common thing that we do. But if you're scrolling really far down the page, that really is a big amount of motion. So if I'm like, I want to go read about some other part, and it's like scroll, and you're like, cool, that animated scroll was helpful, but also a really large amount of motion, right? We're going really far. This particular library that I'm using this example adjusts the speed at least. Some of them keep the speed the same, so if you scroll really far, it's like, bleh, and if you scroll not very far, it's like dunk, 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 which is fun. But we're still getting this really big motion, no matter how fast or slow it is. And this is something that Eric Bailey mentions in his article called Paint the Picture and Not the Frame, where sometimes we've added animation to kind of enhance the way a browser handles a thing, but we could just kind of fall back to what the browser would have done anyways if we want to reduce the motion. So in this case, we could be like, hey, we're doing a JavaScript, since it's a JavaScript library, scrolling library. We're like, if people ask for reduced motion, let's just turn off the scroll. And a lot of these various things like this scroll library and other JavaScript animation things will have some pretty easy ways you can just disable disable animations. And when you're doing it this way, you can say disable that one. Not all of them, but just that one, or whichever ones might be problematic. In this particular case, you can just turn off the scroll, and then when we go and do this now, we just get the default browser behavior of just skipping to that anchor, which we don't get that information of that animated scroll down to the position, but we also don't get motion that's potentially going to be triggering, and we're not serving up that motion to the person who's requested reduced motion. So there's a lot of different ways we can do this as far as identifying what could be triggering and reducing it. And those kind of reduced versions don't necessarily have to be something that is super involved or really tricky to do, especially if we're kind of planning for this ahead of time. So when I got to this part of making the talk, I'm like, cool, these are some examples, these are useful. And then I was like, wait, am I telling everyone to do a billion hours more work? Are they all gonna hate me? So I decided to do some research, and I was like, all right, I'm going to look at the top 10, Alexa top 10 sites, and go through them. These are them, if you're wondering. Go through them and just kind of follow some typical user flows, note which kind of animations I see, note what they're made of and which ones might be triggering. Because assuming you're making a site that exists for you to go do a thing, you probably have typical types of flows, and how many animations that I run into while going through these sites actually need to be reduced. And the answer is really not very many. Most of these had 3, maybe 4 when I was poking around them doing usual things that would actually be fall into the category of potentially triggering and would need to be handled in some way to have a reduced version. Most of the things were very small movements, color fades, opacity fades, that should be fine anyways, that would not have that potential to be triggering. So the number of things you might need to reduce is probably a lot smaller than you think. And in that sense, if you only have 4 or 5 interactions that require animations to be reduced, that's going to be a lot easier to address individually than trying to find a blanket solution for everything. But one thing I did find when I was going through these sites that I did not expect to find is that most of the triggering motion they had on these sites were not like CSS or JavaScript animations at all. They are videos and animated GIFs. What? We always forget about these in this conversation. We're like, yep, reduce all the CSS and JavaScript motion, very important. And then you're like, but you have an auto-playing video that just goes forever and is like full screen in the background. Still counts as motion. And these can be handled, we can handle these with reduced motion queries as well. But I thought it was really interesting. I'm like, oh, that one should be reduced. I'm like, oh, that's an animated GIF. Interesting. So our friend Dave Rupert, who you'll see on stage later, along with Brad Frost, came up with a way of using reduced motion with a picture element that I thought was super clever, which can be a really great trick for providing a static animated, a non-animated GIF in place of an animated GIF when someone has requested reduced motion. It can actually be done in the picture element, which is kind of cool. And there's other ways to do it as well, where it's like you could even just kind of wrangle your own JavaScript to be like, hey, is the prefers reduced motion set to true? Cool, replace all my GIFs with this not moving GIF. Because it's still a GIF, that's weird. Anyways, there's ways you can handle that. And we can do similar things with video as well, and I have a link to a post that describes a way to do that in the links that go with this talk. So we can use prefers reduced motion to handle videos and animated GIFs that might be animated as well. And you might find, if you're like those sites, that that's what you have to do more of than anything else. But I also looked at another category of sites. Jeffrey mentioned that I do the UI animation newsletter, and oftentimes I'll feature a site that's like really highly animated, like an experience site that's done with like 3JS, Canvas stuff, all of those things. I'm like, what would they need to do to respect reduced motion? Because that's going to be a very different situation, right? Like especially, like in those cases, CSS isn't going to do anything for you because all of that animation is generally done in JavaScript, usually with some sort of library like 3JS or something else. And it's for things that we might see like the Spotify stuff that's really built more to be an experience, right? A data viz type thing than a task-based site. It's like when they show you like, hey, you like music, you like this band. And that's like the whole like, if you've been through these on Spotify, it like shows you all your things, gives you all your stats and all of that, and it's very zoomy and 3D and all of those things. Like, what would sites like that need to do? And for those, it definitely is a different story, right? Finding the ones that need to be reduced and reducing them is going to give you a list of like probably every animation. Like I think just about every movement we saw there, it was like multi-speed, parallaxy stuff, and probably would require some sort of different way of handling it. And I should note that it's not necessarily every site that uses 3JS or Canvas. There are sites like this that the folks at Rally put together, where this is a site that actually does have 3JS. There's a spinny globe. It's very 3D. It maybe even plays. Yep, it spins. Whoa, there's animation and stuff. But they have this set up in a way that like that 3JS globe is a background layer, and that text that's animating is real text. You can tab to it. That button you can tab to, and it takes you to a form you can fill out with a keyboard. So like, the choosing to use something like 3JS or Canvas doesn't necessarily mean like you're down a road that you can't ever do anything about. So there's some great examples of kind of mixing layers in that sense. But anything that's highly animated like that and really relying on a lot of those kind of more experiential animations, that's a situation where thinking about providing a custom toggle becomes probably the sort of thing you want to consider. This is a really great example from Marcy Sutton, where it's my favorite example of any of the custom toggles I've seen, because she does it in a really smart way. You can check out this CodePen or the course that it's from to go into the code in detail, but essentially what she does, she sets up a function that turns off all the triggering animation. In this case, this is a pulsing circle that's like blah, 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 which is like definitely very triggering. So she just makes it stop it. And so she sets up that function. And there's two ways to trigger that function. The first thing it looks for is like, has the person requested, like, have they said they prefer reduced motion? If they do, call that function done. The other thing it does is if you click that toggle that says turn off animation, it will also call that same function to turn off the animation. And then to make it one step better, she saves that preference in local storage. So if you come back to that site tomorrow or 2 weeks from now, it knows that you asked to toggle that animation off, so it starts with it off again. And I'm like, oh, so smart. So like this sort of handling is definitely something you would need to do at the beginning of a project, right? Like this would be pretty, well, it's still possible, but it would be easier if you knew you were going to do it at the beginning. But there's definitely ways to really intelligently and like in a kind of like action and component-based way to do this. And maybe you're like, well, toggles, that's weird. No one uses toggles, right? Like, I don't want to be the weird site. I don't know, is that a fear people have? Probably not. Be the weird site, just do it, it's fine. But we do see these more than you might think. Like, for example, Twitter's like, hey, would you like to turn motion off in our site? They have a whole settings panel, and one of the things is like a motion toggle. I've even seen it in articles. This is an article about the dark side of the grid, where they're showing some examples, and these examples are animated, and they have this little button that's like, do you want to start the animation? And then when you start the animation, it's like, doop-a-doop, play, 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 and then it changes to, do you want to stop the animation? And you're like, yeah, I do. I'd like to continue reading. So like, toggles show up in a lot of different places. It's maybe not as novel or as strange of a thing as we might initially think. And kind of tying on to that reduced motion picture element that Dave and Brad posted about, Chris Coyer tried out an example with animated GIFs, where basically what he set up in this CSS Tricks article is like, what if your animated GIFs played normally, right? And then if someone has reduced motion selected, then they get a toggle to start it if they want to. So I'm like watching these GIFs, then I go check reduced motion. This is a fun trick too. And then it's like, there's a button that says, do you want to start these GIFs again? Which is pretty cool as well. So there's a lot of different ways we can surface these preferences for people that may or may not know that they can make this OS preference, while also respecting the preference that they have set it without making it super extra complicated for us. And this is actually a really interesting article as well, because some of the comments, people are like, well, what if I just don't want animated GIFs, but I want the other animation? Prefers reduced motion is just an all or nothing thing, which is also an interesting kind of thing to tackle in that space, where it's like, oh yeah, it's kind of all or nothing. You're taking out the GIFs and the auto-playing video and everything else as well. But I think there's some really interesting ways we can handle this. And like I said, this is still fairly new that it's been supported so widely. So we're seeing a lot of these articles and techniques and suggestions coming out, even in the last few months or weeks. And I think as we go forward, collectively, as an industry, we're going to come up with even more ideas of how we can handle this more elegantly. I think these ones are some of the best ones I've seen recently, but I'm sure there's going to be even better stuff that we can use and more clever solutions as we go on. So I hope that all of this has helped you to show how we can be creative with motion, while also still being really creative and also still being inclusive and creating those diversity of ways to participate without giving up the things that we want to say and having art direction and messaging and all of those things. By keeping an eye out for that triggering motion and then dealing with each one individually or dealing with them as we need to, we can create a custom toggle, use the prefers motion query, whatever we want to do. We can expand the audience of who can meaningfully participate in our projects, and that's probably a pretty good thing for everyone. So I'm going to be around the whole rest of today. If you ever want to talk about any of this stuff or animation things, yeah, we can talk about it anytime. And thanks so much for listening.